One time for your mind, I welcome you all back. Do you ever feel like work is consuming every bit of you? It's your time, it's your energy, it's your mental and physical health, it's your sense of purpose. Have you ever thought about how did we get to this point? Why does the week feel the way it does? Why does the weekend feel like it's this separate thing, like it's this force of nature? Why does Friday night feel the way it does? Today I wanted to invite you on a little journey with me to break down what work exactly is. And a little bit of a disclaimer. I know that, some of these uncomfortable truths that we may confront in the process will, will feel a little bit real to you or make you feel like that, that is something you can relate to, but you know, rest assured, versus everything, we're not here about hopelessness and despair. As we go through these series, as we make our way through these concepts, we're here to figure out a better way to move forward, to hopefully spark that light to make those changes in our lives and in society in general. So I wanted to invite you on this journey with me today as we look at the evolution of work as to what values have driven us to have this culture that we have, and ultimately provoke some thought around what we can do to make this better. I'm Architect AP, and you're listening to Versus Everything. For us to understand who we are in this system and how we came to be the way we are, I think we need to go right back to the inception of the Industrial Revolution. And that was about the mid-18th century. So prior to that, humanity was actually in the big way still in a survival mode. We still, we often lived off the land and, we farmed, and a lot of our activities were either, kind of agriculture or craft based. So you could, if you were farming, you could be working 7 days a week for months on end, just, during this harvest season. And then you could be out of work for a while because the harvest season's over, and you lived off of what you harvested. You could have been a craftsperson, you could have been, say, a shoemaker, you make shoes. From top to bottom, from start to finish, you make shoes. You could be making pottery. You could be making tools. You could be a blacksmith, right? And at a certain point in mid-18th century, and it started in the British Empire, it started in Britain, there was a bit of a technological progress, right? We had the steam engine, and suddenly we decided, okay, we can make factories. And this is where the Industrial Revolution started, because rich people, essentially, the elites, they built factories, they started up factories, and they've started up factory lines. So basically what that meant is, if you take the same shoemaker, for example, you now didn't have one guy that made shoes from start to finish. You had a factory line. You had a guy that made the soles, you had the guy that made the shoelaces, you had another guy gluing it all together, and basically these guys would stay there and do this all day long. Right, and this, and they would do this under some brutal conditions as well, because at the very start, before we figured out that we needed laws and rules around this, these people were very exploited. It was people working like 14-hour day shifts, 6 or 7 days a week. They were living in pretty, bad conditions, because you got to remember, at the time, these are people that, they weren't living in suburbs the way we are living now. They weren't living in these neighborhoods. They would move closer to the factory to kind of live around it somewhere, but at the same time, they didn't have anywhere to live. So whoever owned the factory would often house these people, but they would house them in some pretty crappy conditions. And, at the same time, they didn't really look after the people when they were at work either. They would work them until they collapse, and if they were to, for example, get injured at work by the machinery, the factory owners would care more about the machinery than they would about the people. And at the time as well, there weren't any real laws around these things, so they could just let you go on the spot, say, well, you're injured, what good are you to me now? Off you go, I don't need you anymore. So same as pay. There weren't any real laws around this, so they could pay them as little as they want. It's like, well, if you don't like it, go somewhere else or find another guy who wants a job. And, having such a dynamic created a lot of civil unrest because people very quickly got tired of this. It started taking a toll on their mental health, on their physical health, on their living conditions, and people started essentially revolting. And, the ruling elites didn't like so much civil unrest. So basically, as a compromise, they started coming up with all these kind of laws and rules around how workers should be treated. So this is when things like the minimum wage came about. So they said, okay, you have to pay them a minimum of that much, so it doesn't feel like they don't feel like they're being exploited. They set certain rules about the maximum working hours. So this is the Industrial Revolution, is where the 40-hour work week came out of. The whole concept of a 9 to 5, the Monday to Friday. The 2 days that you get at the end of the week to, for rest and recreation, so to speak. So this is where this came out of. And, these are the laws that kind of set the foundation for where we are today. And the further that went, at the kind of, once it got to early 20th century, this is when the workers really started organizing. This is when workers got together and they started understanding their power in these dynamics. They started saying essentially, okay, look, well, you may own the factory, but if we don't work, you're not getting any product out of this. You're not making any money. You're not selling anything, So they've realized their power and they started trying to organize. And, this is where unions and things like that started coming about. And essentially, like it wasn't something that came about overnight. There was actually a lot of struggle for the workers to get to that point. There was a lot of striking. There was these protests were often treated very violently. The owners of factories, they would turn to law enforcement and cover kind of private hired muscle to try and disperse these things in a rather violent manner. And because these were matters between employer and employee, quite often, nobody was really held responsible for these acts of violence. And as that went further, though, I think the workers still kind of persevered in a kind of unionized, and they negotiated better conditions for themselves. And essentially, this is something I've mentioned in my previous episode about generations, where the urban migration started, because now the conditions were actually sufficiently good enough for people to say, hey, okay, maybe I can move out of this kind of country farming lifestyle and I can move to a more urban area where there are factories, and I can work at a factory because the living conditions would be better. I could make more money. I could have a more comfortable life. And you could say, I guess this was like one of the higher points for the workers. I think like, again, to thinking back to the generational podcast that I had, I think this would have been around the time of the pre-World War II and post-World War II. It was around that, this whole silent generation, around that time. And after that, I think this is what, when these companies kind of notice that, okay, maybe if we actually treat our workers well, they'll be more productive. We will grow. We will sell. At the same time, if you pay people, these very same people will be able to buy things. So the economy grew. Production went up, consumption went up, and this is what gave rise to this modern consumerism. You work, you get paid, you spend money. Somebody makes this stuff somewhere. And at the same time as well, I think looking back around that time, this is when a lot of these companies started growing to the point where they decided that they needed to kind of create these corporate hierarchies. And this is where the corporations that we know of today came about. This whole like white collar worker class, these managers and strategists and office workers essentially. So despite this, regardless of what the company might be doing, everybody now has office workers, these clerical admin people, these strategists, these middle managers, etc. And this is, I think, when the scales tipped once again, because this is when the companies kind of figured out a way to reduce their accountability, because you no longer were dealing with, like this one guy that owns the factory, this kind of mogul. You're now dealing with these limited liability entities that are now kind of made up of directors and investors and shareholders. So there isn't really one person you can hold accountable for this. And anytime you kind of try to raise any issues, you have to go through so many circles of bureaucracies and basically all these people who point at each other saying, well, he's responsible for this, he's responsible for that, don't look at me. So reality is, it was a lot harder to solve these problems. And the only way that you could really do that is by having some sort of legislation around this. But moving forward, the kind of this new corporate culture, it created a whole new class of worker. And when it grew to that extent, when even the people in this kind of, shall we say, the white collar class started feeling like cogs in the bigger machine, in a similar way that the first workers felt, things started getting bad again. There was a lot of kind of this disassociation with these systems, and people just showed up and cut a check and went home, and again productivity reduced. And I think this, like going back to the different generations, it's the generation that kind of had to work in cubicles. It's the Fight Club generation. It's the Generation X that like when the corporates were kind of at their peak, and you had all these like levels of managers that were doing these kind of, in the big scheme of things, meaningless jobs that, like you were just sitting there stacking papers all day, answering emails, and you didn't really know what what all that was for. Somebody higher up than you did, they realized that, oh, well, it's a part of the process that makes us money, it makes us more efficient and productive. But from your point of view, you were just stuck in this cubicle doing the same repetitive thing. And it kind of started taking a massive toll on people's mental and physical health again. So, like this productivity fell. I think that was around that time. It wasn't so much any kind of civil unrest, but it was more so the economy, the economic downturn that forced these corporations to kind of rethink the way they approach these things. So like, well, okay, these guys are getting sad and depressed and not being productive. How do we deal with this, right? And out of this, came a lot of these movements around, mental health and work-life balance. Again, like not. Unfortunately, none of these things have ever come from a good place. A lot of them have come out from the reaction of the kind of the top of the chain of these corporations, and saying, look, okay, we need to get these people working again. What can we do? Like we've tried a lot of things. We tried little, office birthday parties and pizza parties, but well, still not responding. Maybe it's because they're too isolated. Let's create open working spaces, and now we're starting to, you're starting to understand where I'm headed, because we're now talking about something a bit more modern. And, as we kind of progressed into this stage as well, I think it kind of came parallel to the technological progresses. So, collaboration became a lot easier for us, by way of emails and, online communications. And, there were certain jobs that were able to be done, from home. You could work from home. You could decentralize some of these things. But with that being said, I think this is when the workers again were kind of, like they lost a bit of their power, because essentially as accountability from these companies reduced, because again, nobody was being held responsible for these things. At worst, like if a company got into trouble, they would just be fined. They'd take a bit of their money, but it's business as usual the next day. It's very rarely that a company would get into trouble to such an extent that they would actually be, not allowed to operate, or, would take some sort of serious penalty. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of like, well, it's become the cost of the game, really. Um, and yeah, this kind of brings us to the modern age. And I think, like having lived through COVID, we now have this whole concept of, work-life balance. We kind of, we're a lot more aware of these things. For some reason, it took us an entire lockdown to realize that maybe constantly being on call, that maybe this technology that kind of allowed us to be so efficient maybe is actually working to our detriment, because we never disconnect. Because back in the day, you could just kind of clock in, clock out, and when you're done, you're done. Now you're taking this stuff with you home. Now you're checking emails at home. Now somebody can call you and say, oh, where is this, where is that, and they're disturbing your peace during your own time, during your personal time that you're meant to be using for your own kind of recreation and recovery. And like this kind of gave rise to a lot of to what we now call the gig economy. So people are freelancing, people are kind of got all these side hustles and going from one to the other. But at the same time, this is the thing that also kind of led to the demise of unions. To a lot of people these days, I think unions are, quite a foreign concept. We haven't really grown up with unions, and they're not really as big of a thing these days either, unless maybe, you're working as a nurse or as a teacher. Like we see, like just this past week, we've seen teachers striking, right? When a certain profession gets together and tries to negotiate for better conditions, but laws are set up in such a way that, for example, if you're considered some sort of a contractor where you're not a full-time employee, where you don't have that job security, where you don't, like, where they don't have to go through some sort of a process to let you go, well, that's what's up. Like if you don't like it, off you go. Casual contracts, 0-hour contracts, things like that. These are the things that kind of really work against the worker. And I think the key thing that I'm trying to kind of get to the bottom of, do you believe in life after work? Because when you think about it, that's all we do for for a large amount of our lives. For a big part of our lives, we spend that time at work. We don't spend this time with our families, with our friends, or you know doing the things that we love. And I mean, I know people always talk about, find the right job, find what you're passionate about, but ultimately every job becomes a job, right? You'll be lucky if you can actually find something that you like 100% of, but ultimately, for the most part, there will always be aspects of your job that that are going to be hard. And I think primarily the biggest issue isn't so much the job itself, because we're all tough people. We all can kind of endure and make these things work. And like a lot of people kind of try to romanticize the hustle. And at the end of the day, it can be done, but but you're also still having to deal with with these bosses, with these people that just don't seem to care for you very much. I think this is something that we're probably going to start noticing right about now again, actually, because you could see that our economy is headed for another recession. I think this, but despite all that, despite the fact that there is an economic downturn, everybody is still trying to make profit. Everybody still expects growth, year on year growth. No one ever expects for things to slow down. Every year we need to hit it higher and bigger, but everybody feels that way. And if everybody feels that way, at which point do we kind of actually work with the economic cycle, right? So most likely at a certain point you may experience something with, with a boss that is under a lot of pressure to hit these targets, and, that stress is going to be put on you, the worker, because, there's always this false mindset from, from the kind of the top brass that if you make people really sweat for every dollar that they get, somehow that will be more productive. If you make people more stressed, then that means you're getting more value for your money. If you make people feel less secure about, the kind of potential job cuts in your company, then they'll work harder and, be more productive. But, despite the fact that literally everything points the other way, that people work better when they're treated better, when they feel more secure, when they're allowed more time to rest and recover. For some reason, we just can't seem to get that through our heads. One of the latest trends that I've noticed talked about, especially all over the internet, is the 4-day work week. Which, I've always thought to myself, it's actually not a bad idea because, think about it. Like, every time the weekend ends, you think to yourself, like, if only I had just that one more day. And reality is, because that's, like in the world that moves so fast, most of the time you're going to spend one whole day preparing for this next week. So really, reality is you only get one day. You got that one day where you actually get to relax, and then you spend the next day getting ready for the next week of work. And it's just an endless cycle, And this is when people start talking about how, well, you weren't born to just kind of work, go into debt, work some more and die. This is when, people's existence starts to feel so futile. So again, hopefully, it gets through to people. Every research shows that it actually works, that kind of reducing this need for just, mere presence at work makes people more focused and more productive. You can do more in the 4 days than you would in the 5 days because you're not sitting there mucking around at work. You're not just biding your time. You're actually there doing something productive. But, we shall see where this takes us. In any case, I hope this gave you some food for thought. This is something that we're going to build on as we go further. But, this is just a taste. This is just me attempting to open up your life. What is your life? Who are you? We've discovered what generations mean, why we feel and think the way they do. We now figured out how we work, how we got to the point, how we work. What's next? Find out in the next episode of Versus Everything. I'm Architect AP. One time for your mind. I'll catch you next time.